Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for your essential introduction to the new MBTI Global Assessment webinar. My name is Stu Belcher. I'm one of the product managers here at the Myers-Briggs company, and I'll be co-presenting alongside Rich Thompson, our Senior Director of Research. So today's webinar will run for approximately 30 minutes, and we'll be exploring a brief review of the MBTI assessment and why the MBTI Global Assessment was developed, and an overview of the MBTI Global Step 1 and Step 2 questionnaire, the new probability index, the MBTI manuals, and support materials. We'll reserve the last 5 to 10 minutes to answer your questions, so start thinking about what you may want to ask, and please submit at any time using the question functions in the webinar controls. We'll have Kim, our marketing manager, will be monitoring those questions, and she'll be sharing some of those with Rich and myself at the end of the session. Our objective for this webinar is that you leave feeling confident enough to start using the MBTI Global Assessment. So please note the webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending out an email with links to the slides and a recording and answers to some of those questions in the next few days. So do keep posted for that. Before we go any further though, I'd just like to highlight how the MBTI has continuously evolved since the first version of the instrument was copyrighted back in 1943. During those 75 years, we've seen no less than 4 new versions released, with the ones that we're all most familiar with, Form M and European Step 1, released in 1998. On November the 26th, the MBTI Global Assessment went live on Elevate. It's available to all qualified individuals with an Elevate license, and you may have noticed that we have a banner right on the dashboard advertising its availability. This takes you to a landing page that provides some essential information to help you get started, and that includes a downloadable FAQ. The MBTI Global Assessment is currently supported by a selection of core reports and instructional materials. You can find these on the Elevate catalogue here. They include 6 reports, a new manual, and for now, these are all available in English language only. Each report comes with some additional personalized online content that practitioners can choose to share with their respondents. We do hope that by the end of this webinar, you'll feel confident to start exploring the global assessment for yourselves and its supporting products. However, I'd like to reassure you all that it will take time to roll out the globally, and we have no immediate plans to retire previous versions. The new global assessment sits alongside previous versions, which all remain good to use. Now, I'm very happy to hand it over to Rich Thompson. Rich leads the Myers-Briggs company's research efforts worldwide and provides strategic input on cross-functional product development efforts. Rich, you're up.
Thanks, Stu. Hi, everybody. Like Stu said, my name is Rich Thompson. I'm the Senior Director of Research at CPP, now the Myers-Briggs company, and I was very involved in the work on the revised assessments. And I'm happy to walk you through some of the key findings and information regarding the 2 global assessments that we have released. At the outset of this project involving the Myers-Briggs Foundation, we had 2 goals for our revision. One was primarily to preserve the integrity of the assessments as they exist, and if possible, to try to improve the assessments over what we had before. Specifically, as part of that improvement, we really wanted to update and collect representative samples in more countries around the world. For those of you who are more familiar with the MBTI, you might know that for the current versions, we only have 2 actual representative samples. We also wanted to use a statistical model that's more consistent with type theory than was used previously. And one of the main things is if the data supported it, we wanted to have the same scoring routine globally so that it would be easy to compare scores across countries and use reports with different populations. For those of you with a more of an intuition preference, this is what the sampling plan looked like. You'll notice that we had some what we call large representative samples where our targets were to exceed prior samples or to have more than 1,000 people. And then the moderate representative samples, our goals there were to hit about 500 people. And the non-representative samples from distributors were really opportunistic data collection that we did as part of, that started after the project was underway, but using the new versions that we'd be able to evaluate those. For those with more of a S preference, these are the numbers that we ended up with. You'll notice that for both the UK and the US, which is where we had representative samples before, we exceeded the prior sample size for those representative samples. And then we ended up with a fairly large number of reasonably large samples in other countries, primarily in Europe, but also in South Africa and some parts of Asia. The languages that will be available on Elevate starting in January include the list here. There are 27 different languages. As Stu noted, right now everything is available only in English. Pause for a second there so you can look at that list. And then just in terms of how we went about doing the work, we had what we called the research version of the MBTI. It had 230 items, primarily drawn from prior work on the MBTI, but it did include all of the items in the commercial Form M and Form Q, and the European Step 1 and Step 2, and a number of research items that had been experimented with on prior forms. For the large representative samples, we implemented the data collection using a customized version of MBTI Complete. So we were able to get people to fill out the assessment and get their best fit type as well. For the other samples, we used a different version where we didn't get best fit type. So best fit type was really obtained mostly from US, UK, Canada, and Australia. Jumping ahead a little bit, what we ended up with was a 92-item version of the MBTI, down one item from the current Form M, and up a few items from the current European Step 1. It draws largely and equally from Form M and European Step 1 item sets. What that means is the overlap between M and Step 1 is about 70% because those two instruments already shared a fairly large number of items. But what we capitalized on were the items that worked particularly well outside of the US to try to make sure that we had a measure that worked reasonably well in all countries and languages in what we call the global sample. So to get to the new assessment, we ended up doing a lot of analyses to just kind of demonstrate to ourselves that prior work was still relevant and that the new approach, this latent class analysis approach, got us to a similar place. And so we had 3 different researchers independently do different analyses. We had one person do classical test theory, which is what we used for Form G. We had one person use for item response theory, which was used for Form M. And then we had another person do latent class analysis. Latent class analysis is essentially a statistical method that's used for finding subtypes, or what we call latent classes, from categorical data. In other words, the MBTI usually has dichotomous responding, and is trying to put people into buckets or categories, and is the appropriate method for doing that kind of work. So we used that approach at the end of the day because the 3 approaches really led you to a very similar end result for a Step 1 or a Step 2 assessment. And we thought that by focusing on the latent class approach, it would make more sense given that is the appropriate approach for getting people into the correct categories, which I've already said here. But one of the people who was involved in this is a guy named Jay Magison. He is an expert on latent class analysis, and he had used this previously in a revision of the MMTech for CAPT. So we had some prior experience with it, and we found that it worked very well for what we were trying to achieve. So like I said, for some participants, we asked them how their best fit type and how certain they were of each of their preferences. And we used that information to determine the items that were relevant for each of the preferences and identified separate weights for each of those items. As we worked our way through, one of the key differences between latent class and the prior versions is that we had some items where they had what we call strong error correlations. And those are items where maybe the same stem was used in part of two questions. And under the rules of latent class, you couldn't have those strong, what we call bivariate correlations or error correlations. And so some good items were actually removed from the step 1 version of the global assessment. And it does result in slightly lower internal consistency reliabilities. And the consistency of the response that we end up with in terms of what we're reporting on what we now call the probability index, we ended up with a smaller number of categories than what we had before. So one of the main things that results from the work that we did is a change from the PCI to something that we now call the probability index, which you can see here. We still give people their 4 letters, of course, and we then estimate how likely it is that these results are accurate for them. One of the main things that we did in the creation of the PI, or the probability index, was we looked at the likelihood, or we looked at people's initial results, and then we had their retest results. And so we looked at if people had a particular response pattern at time 1 and a particular response pattern at time 2, how likely is it that they would get the same result on retest? So what the PI actually tells you, or what it really is saying, is when you get that after somebody takes the assessment the first time, is it tells you based on their response pattern, a likelihood that they would get the same result on retest. And I think that the explanation of that makes a lot more sense than what we had on the PCI. So for the global step 2, we ended up with 143 items, down from 144. There are about 5 to 11 questions per facet. We did explore the possibility of additional facets through a number of different analysis approaches. And given that we had used an assessment, a research assessment that had primarily depended on prior commercial versions, it's not surprising we didn't find anything, but we certainly gave it a try. And we looked at different ways of scoring the facets. We did look at latent class analysis, and we eventually ended up coming back to IRT, which is what's currently used on the Form Q. And we did that primarily because in conversations with Elle Hammer and Naomi Quank and Peter Myers, we concluded that some of the facets are a little bit more trait-like and some of them are a little bit more type-like. And rather than switching the analysis approach halfway through, say, a set of facets, we decided to use the same set of facets, same analysis approach for all of the facets. So the changes between current Form Q and the global step 2 are less than what you'd expect or what we see for the global step 1. A couple of other changes that we made were that we allowed items to load on multiple facets. What that means is there can be an item that is on multiple facets within a preference. And in one case, we allow it to go outside of a preference. The facets all now have additional, in the reports, additional mid-zone descriptors for the underlying preference. So that's not necessarily the research work, but that's an improvement in what's in the report. So much more clear mid-zone descriptors for each of the facets. And we made some changes to the report, including some extra facet information around applications. So the step 2 report has been expanded and made much better than what we had on the Form Q report. There's also some changes to the distribution scores. So we purposely wanted to avoid one of the things that happened on Form Q, which is where you would get somebody who would have a particular preference and then maybe have 4 or 5 facets out of preference. By allowing some of those cross-loadings within preferences across the facets, we were able to pull that down. So 59% of the scores are in preference, which is down from 64% in Form Q. 33% of the scores are in the mid-zone, which is up from 26%. And part of the reason for that change is that, according to Naomi, people really like the mid-zones. They like being in the mid-zone, and so getting a few more people with those mid-zone improved descriptors is something that we were trying to achieve. And 8% of scores are out of preference, which is down from 10%. And you should never see a case, in the data we have so far, we never have a case where there are 5 out of preferences. And if my memory is correct, it's very, very, very rare to see even 4 out of preferences. So the beauty of the assessments is that they provide consistency for all users. At present, if you're in Europe, you get a different assessment and a different report than you get in the rest of the world. I think that the probability index, which is replacing the preference clarity index, is a big improvement in terms of its interpretation. Again, it means literally the likelihood of getting the same result on retest. The latent class approach is a better statistical approach for the MBTI step 1. And the IRT that we still use for the global step 2 creates a lot more consistency for those of you who are either learning Form Q or working on improving your skills there. The changes are a lot smaller on that particular assessment. So I've gone fairly fast, so I apologize for that. But at the end of the day, what we have is the new manual, which is available in print and PDF form. We've combined the step 1 and step 2 manuals into a single manual, which I think is a big improvement. One of the other main things, though, to keep in mind is that because we have all these other languages, we couldn't embed all of that into the manual. It would have been uncarryable if you had it in print. And so we do have these supplements for each of the different language and country combinations. So for example, if you can see on the slide here, we have this North American English supplement for the United States. Other parts of the world who use North American English will have North American English for Australia or North American English for Singapore, or they'll have European English for the UK, and so on. Those are all free, and those are things that you can hand out to your participants if you wanted to, or that you can look at and study. Each of the type distributions for all of the different language country combinations can be found in those supplements, along with some reliability and validity information. So they are an important component of the manual. They're just not embedded in the manual, and you can download those as you need them. And you can see here that we have them available on a website. And the ones that, I believe 11 of them have been released, and the rest will be released in January of 2019. So as part of this webinar, we are offering a 15% off the manual. And if you go to the Myers-Briggs.com site or your Elevate account and search for product number 6131, you can then use the promo code Global15 at checkout and get that 15% off on your manual. The manual was written largely by Al Hammer and Naomi Quank, and they did a fantastic job of really modernizing our understanding of type, explaining how to use the assessment, and really put in a huge amount of effort on a very large and expansive section of validity and reliability information that I think most people will find very useful. So Stu, I think it goes back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. So thanks so much for trying to squeeze so much great content into such a short amount of time. I'm sure we've got a number of great questions coming in as well, and we wanted to leave plenty of time for that. But before we get into that, I just wanted to give you all a bit of a highlight into some of the things which are coming in 2019. As I mentioned earlier, we are in the process of rolling this out in a gradual phased approach. So these are some of the things you'll see in the next 12 months or so. The first one of those is the rollout of the MBTI Complete. So we'll have availability and compatibility with MBTI Complete, and I'm hoping that's going to be out before Christmas. So that'll be pretty exciting. We'll then roll that out into MBTI Online, so that'll become the default assessment for MBTI Online. And then we'll be releasing the MBTI Step 2 User Guide, and I expect that to be out in the end of January, beginning of February time. And then the next big thing for us will be the process of starting to include the MBTI Global Assessment in our certification program for those English language certification programs. So that will happen starting first in the US and then gradually rolling out in other territories. So those are some of the main things which are coming in 2019. Kim, do you have some questions for us that have come in from the audience?
I do. Here are a couple questions that I received throughout the webinar. The first one, can you share a quick summary of how the updated manual differs from the previous? Is it a substantial update with new info or only targeted revisions as needed?
I can do my best from memory on that. So the first 6 chapters are the combination of global step 1 and step 2. So they're broken out, to talk about type in general, using some modernized language and modernized kind of thinking about how we talk about the preferences. Similarly for the facets. Then like I said, the main chapter on the construction of the assessments is in chapter 7, and I think I'm obviously biased as a researcher. The real meat is in the updated chapters on validity of the MBTI. Now, keep in mind that because Form M and the global step 1 correlate very highly in terms of the results that you get, same with Form Q, all prior research on the MBTI is still relevant to the MBTI in general. And if my memory's right, the validity chapter for step 1 is almost as thick as the rest of the manual. So Al Hammer did a great job of really summarizing all of the work that's been done for decades and giving you lots of information for critics or whoever might ask questions about the MBTI and demonstrating its utility. So it's a fairly substantial revision to the prior manual, maybe a little bit less information on applications. We took most of the application information out. So it's much more focused on kind of the overview of type, step 1 and step 2 facets, and the construction, reliability, and validity.
All right. Another question. I use the MBTI career version. Will that be available in a global version? If not, how long will the current version be available?
The current version will be available for a while. I don't want to make any promises about when things will come out, but we are going to update the career report into consistent with the global version and possibly even do some updates to the career content that's in there.
Okay, so there's a question around the preference clarity. I like to talk about preference clarity. Is that something I can't talk about anymore?
Well, the new PI is not about clarity. It's about the likelihood of getting the same results on retest. However, you can still use similar language, I think, to talk about it because it's still an indication of how consistent the person responded with other people who share that preference. So as the PI value gets larger, let's say it's a 90, or and it's very, very, very likely in terms of what's printed on the report. What that means is that person is probably very clear in their preference because they responded in a manner that's consistent with other people who are very clear, and so on. So I think you could talk about it in a very similar way. The big difference is the numbers that underlie it are less about the distribution of scores, which is what the PCI was, and more about that consistency with people on retest. Hopefully that answers your question. I think you can talk about it the same way. It's just, I think, a better indicator.
Yeah, and I can probably just add something just add a little bit further clarity. Just to be super clear, the probability index relates specifically to the MBTI Global Assessment. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we have no immediate plans to retire Form M, Form Q, or the European Step 1 and Step 2 versions of the assessment. And those still do use the Preference Clarity Index, and they're available for you to use. And in many cases, they will be the most appropriate thing for you to use if you're using other languages, which we don't have available currently in the global assessment. So over time that will be phased out, but if you choose to use those previous versions, then preference clarity still applies and is perfectly acceptable and works for you to use there.
All right, the next question is, Isabel Myers made sure that she analyzed each preference for all of the types to which the preference was relevant, meaning a sensing item was tested for all 8 sensing types. Was a similar analysis applied here? Latent analysis would not necessarily do so?
Not exactly the way that Isabel did it. We did do our work a little bit differently. I will say that one of the things that she also worked on was something, and the name of it is escaping me at the moment, where you look at the whole type, not just the preferences. And we did do some of that work in terms of looking at when we were doing the latent class analysis, we ended up, and it's explained in Chapter 7, with some additional classes where people were very clear or somewhat clear, etc. In other words, the response pattern to the set of items differentiated them from other people in the same preference. So even though they were an E or they were an I, their total pattern of responding differentiated them from other people who were maybe less clear or had a lower PI. So no, we didn't do it exactly the way she did it, but I think we did it's what she called detailed scoring, and we did some of that work as part of this to ensure that we were accurate.
All right, a question. Are there any plans to gather data from India or the Indian subcontinent in your research?
As data is collected in other countries, regions, etc., we will continue to add technical documents as we have done historically for M&Q and European Step 1 and Step 2. So while we don't have a sample of India at present, we do a lot of business in India, and I imagine within a year or two, we'll have a pretty good sample where we can look at Indian data on the new version.
Okay, and the question around a sample report, is there a place to get a sample report to actually see it?
Stu?
Yes. Yes, they should be available to download from the current landing page that we have at the moment for the MBTI Global Assessment, which you can see at the moment at the bottom of your screen. I do recall hearing that there was some issues in terms of making those available, but we will certainly have them available by the end of the week, and you'll be able to download them from that page. Sample copies are available on Elevate. So if you go to Elevate in the product catalog, you can download those from there. But for those who do not have access to Elevate, we will be able to make them available via the landing page, via the URL which you see at the bottom of your screen at the moment.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. The question is, does the global report have industry, job, and or functional norms available?
If I'm understanding the question, within a specific existing report, the answer is no. In those technical supplements, it does describe the folks in the sample in terms of their occupation, not necessarily industry, but occupation, gender, ethnicity, and so on. But no, in terms of report for federal accountants, federal workers who are accountants, we don't have that at this point. We do have some of that information in other resources, however.
All right, well, we are coming up against the top of the hour, and we've run out of time for our Q&A, but we will be sending out a follow-up email to all that registered with the recording links and any questions that we didn't get to. In the meantime, if you want to learn more about the MBTI Global Assessment, you can visit the website, themyersbriggs.com/MBTI Global Assessment. And thank you all for attending today, and have a great rest of your day.